What's up guys, my name is Darren Jackson, welcome back to the channel. Now I think as investors, this is super obvious by the way, we're lucky that we're not forced to invest into one particular stock, which is super amazing because there are over 3,000 stocks currently in the stock market right now. We have IPOs coming up left and right, so more and more adding themselves into the stock market each day. So if you wanted to, you could have your portfolio be of every single stock in the stock market. You could even invest into an ETF that virtually puts your hands onto every company in the stock market. But that's another video for another day. But imagine that you actually had to select a stock to invest into, maybe between 3 or 4 other stocks in a similar sector. Not only did you have to pick that stock, but you have to believe that that particular stock that you're selecting is going to take off in productivity and results, and therefore the stock price first. And let's say for this hypothetical example, you have to pick between these 3 companies. 3 companies that we've talked about a decent amount of times on this video, being Ideanomics, Hyliion Holdings, and Metamaterials. All 3 companies that I personally believe in, and all 3 companies I think are going to have their time and take off significantly to the prices that we believe that they're going to be. But imagine you had to choose one. Which one do you think is going to take off first? And that's what I wanted to talk about today. So hopefully by the end of this video, we can recap what each company is all about and what they do. We can talk about some of the partnerships and or acquisitions that they've made that will potentially help with their growth. We can then talk about, with all that information, what type of impact can they make to their sector or their society and or even the world. And then from there, we can answer the most important question. What company do we think will take off first? So let's get started. So first off, we have Ideanomics. Now, Ideanomics is a really interesting company, in my personal opinion, within the tech sector. Their essential goal is to help and persuade other companies to make technological advancements. So they kind of have their hands in different baskets. They're in the fintech sector. They even have their own ATS or alternative trading sector. But the one thing that I think is going to make them the most significant, which I said in a previous video, is their approach within the EV or electric vehicle subsector. Now, one key thing that they do that I think is really amazing is their sales to finance to charging process. This is ultimately what they do with vehicle companies to help persuade them to electrify their fleets. So the sales aspect is basically them persuading the company to electrify their vehicles. The finance aspect is giving them information on how much it'll be for those fleets of vehicles. And the charging category is Ideanomics, basically providing a charging infrastructure for that company. And obviously the partnerships that Ideanomics makes in the future will help persuade that company to do that. They have different categories of how to electrify their vehicles and different charging stations to charge those vehicles with, but we're gonna get into that in a little bit. Speaking of electric vehicles, the next company is Hyliion Holdings. This is a company I talked about back when I invested into it through Torchlight acquisition, which was last year. Hyliion Holdings is an electric vehicle solutions company, particularly for Class 8 vehicles or semi-trucks. And what I really like about this company is there are 2 different approaches to electrifying vehicles. I've talked about that so many times. The first one are their series of electrical components that can be installed onto most of Class 8 electric vehicles, and they call that the Hybrid EX. Their other category is with a fully electric vehicle that they already have called the Hypertruck ERX, which has a built-in generator that can convert stored renewable natural gas from the atmosphere and convert that to electricity that can power the vehicle. And I believe this vehicle can even travel up to 1,000 miles. So they have 2 different categories, which I think are really amazing. And Metamaterials is kind of on its own. It's a very unique type of company that basically specializes in making nanotechnology, primarily with something they call a nanoweb, which is a type of film that has really interesting capabilities that allow it to manipulate different types of wavelengths, primarily light. And they can use that on different applications that expand from automobiles and aerospace to consumer electronics and even into medicine. So they have a benefit of being very unique for one, and also being able to cover different sectors. So that's basically what the companies are all about. But the next thing we need to figure out are some of the important acquisitions and or partnerships that each company has made to help them grow. So with Ideanomics, they've made a few different acquisitions in the past, which is really significant on the fact of what they do, helping persuade multiple types of companies to make tech advances. But recently they announced an acquisition with an electric vehicle company called Via Motors, and I personally believe that is their most significant acquisition. That's why I expressed my opinions in the previous video about the acquisition, that I feel like Ideanomics is starting to become primarily known for their electric vehicle acquisitions and what they can do along those lines and what they can offer to fleets of vehicles and trying to electrify those. Via Motors is really interesting. They are an electric vehicle company that's primarily based off what they call a skateboard. It basically looks like the skateboard. It's like if you took a vehicle and you cut it left and right, and you have the bed left over with the tires. That part is electrified, and they can actually build the rest of the vehicle up top, which I believe could be ranged from a class 2 to 3 to 4 and potentially etc. And they can sell those to fleet owners of vehicles. That aspect's really cool. I've never seen something like that before. It kind of reminds me that when we were kids and we could build cars and stuff like that, kind of like some Hot Wheels type stuff. It's something that I've never seen a company do before, but I feel like that's probably Ideanomics' largest acquisition, especially for a sector I think they're going to shine the most on. Something like what Biomotors does definitely reminds me of what Hyliion's doing with their two different categories of EV solutions for Class 8 vehicles. Speaking of Hyliion, they've made a decent amount of acquisitions in the past, which is why I like this company so much out the gate. They've made acquisitions with companies like Agility, the grocery store chain called Wegmans, but in my personal opinion, the most significant partnership that they've recently made is with a company called Detmar Logistics. Now, Detmar Logistics is a sand fracking logistics company. They ship sand to oil and gas companies to help them use that sand to break down other sand to be able to drill for oil or fracking. Now, when the news was originally released about the partnership between the two companies, Detmar Logistics announced that they would be reserving 100 Hypertruck ERXs. I think they were going to start off with 10, and hopefully that would work out before they get the other 90, which is really significant to us as investors because it shows us that other companies trust what Hyliion has to offer to the point that they're actually purchasing their products and using it in their own fleets. What made this even better is the fact that there were follow-up news that Detmar Logistics actually expanded their partnership with Hyliion and reserved 300 Hypertruck ERXs. So more vehicles, more faith, more trust, better responses from us as investors. Now, Metamaterials, on the other hand, being a non-electric vehicle company, kind of being a company that has its hands in different baskets, allowed them to be a part of different partnerships and acquisitions, such as companies like Sage Geosystems. But recently, they announced news of an acquisition with a company called NanoWeb Security Corporation. And I feel like in the long run, something we'll mention later on in the video, this is probably going to be their biggest acquisition to date, at least. NanoWeb Security is a technology-based company that actually niche-wise does a lot of different things in comparison to Metamaterials, primarily including branding and banknote security. But what makes them a viable partnership for Metamaterials is their production process using roll-to-roll lithography, something that Metamaterials could definitely use for their NanoWeb technology. It's also beneficial because it helps Metamaterial expand. So Metamaterials already announced, I believe, a 60,000+ square foot facility they're building, but NanoWeb actually has a large facility as well that I believe they claim to only use 30% of. So not only does Metamaterial have enough room to use their own technology along with NanoWeb's, but it gives them the opportunity to employ more people to continue to do that. So now that we've broken down what each company is all about, and in my opinion, the more important acquisitions and partnerships that they've done, we can now talk about when they get to a certain point, what could be their impact to society and potentially the entire world. So with companies like Ideanomics and Hyliion Holdings, their impact to society and to the world is pretty straightforward. They will do their part to reduce greenhouse emissions emitted into the atmosphere. The Ideanomics, on one hand, I think their biggest strength is the sales to finance the charging process because it gives them the full grasp of the entire experience for the company that they're trying to help electrify, for example. And the partnerships that Ideanomics makes gives them a larger catalog for those fleet owners to pick from in regards to how they electrify their vehicles, whether they want to use the skateboard aspect from Biomotors or maybe another company. So I think Ideanomics is going to create more of an impact to the world as they continue to acquire more significant and important companies that will help them along the lines of that, whether it's with electric vehicles or it's with the charging aspect or it's with the financing. Speaking of the charging aspect, they actually had another acquisition with a company called Wave, which is basically a ground level charging system. So basically a bus could drive over it essentially and start charging their vehicle, which is super convenient. So I think that's what's going to come down for Ideanomics as far as how they could impact the entire world with greenhouse emissions. However, I think Hyliion Holdings has a bit more of an edge because for one, they're selling their own components and their own vehicles. But when you dive deeper into the ERX, the one thing that it does that a lot of other electric vehicle companies don't do, at least from my knowledge, is creating net negative emissions. Now, we've all heard of net zero emissions where it's basically some type of technology that doesn't emit any CO2 into the atmosphere. But with this, it actually takes away CO2 from the atmosphere. It uses that to generate electricity with its generator in the actual vehicle itself. So it's kind of doing a 2-for-1 thing. And then also the components from the hybrid EX are super convenient, and it probably save fleet owners a lot of money simply for the fact that they can purchase these components rather than having to purchase a full vehicle. Now with Metamaterials, I mentioned earlier about their acquisition with nanotech and how I thought it was really significant because it's going to help with their expansion and productivity. George Palikaris, the CEO of Metamaterials, if you listen to a lot of things that he says, he's never afraid to mention how Metamaterials is the first metamaterials sector category company that's tradable in the stock market. Probably just the first metamaterial related company that's public in general. And that's really significant because I think that gives Metamaterials first dibs on applying their technology to different sectors, whether it's vehicles or aerospace or medicine, and using that technology to help create some type of positive impact. And especially the fact that they're using renewable energy, I think that's going to be something that investors are going to be really interested in. But I think their productivity is what's going to help them be such a juggernaut company, because right now they're the first company of their kind, as far as I know. So you want to keep that first place. One of the things you're going to have to do is remain extremely productive, because that's going to attract more companies as far as the output you can provide within a specific time period. And obviously all these types of impacts, in my personal opinion, from these different companies are really cool. But in order to create these impacts, these companies have to be really innovative. And in order to be really innovative, you gotta have the money to do it. Now, let me preface all this by saying I am not fully experienced or fully confident as far as reading the financial analytics when it comes to investing in companies. That's something I personally need to work on this investing journey to make sure I'm putting my money in potentially the right place, whether it's for the short term or preferably the long term. But I did a lot of studying over the past couple of days, and I think I kind of got a bit of a grasp on it. So one of the things I noticed with each company that's very similar is their operating margin. Their operating margin, I believe for all three, is negative. So for those of you guys that don't know, operating margin is basically the amount of money that a company makes for every dollar that they spend on that particular margin. There's actually profit and operating margin. So in this case, it's what they make per dollar that they spend on operations. The employees that work, the machinery, the facility, et cetera, et cetera. And being negative means that you're spending more money on operations rather than making it back. That seems to make a lot of sense with each of these companies because, for one, they're very new, they're fairly niche, and at this point, they're creating more acquisitions. And with those acquisitions are probably going to require more money to be spent on expansion and employees and all that stuff. So I would kind of assume that we expect numbers like that and percentages like that to be negative for the time being. But hopefully, as people continue to believe in the products and services that each company has to offer, the output is going to outweigh the input and the money that's going into the stuff like the profit and the operations. And hopefully that number will go positive. But that's just something my naive self knows. I know there's more things to see that could be significant in picking a company in this situation. So make sure you guys leave your comments below. Speaking of your comments, this is where we get to the point of choosing which company we think is going to take off first. Now, I actually asked this question on a poll on my Twitter page and my YouTube page, and I got a lot of pretty interesting responses from both. So with YouTube, the biggest consensus was Metamaterials, which makes sense because I think the majority of my subscribers are coming from my Metamaterials videos, which I appreciate you guys, by the way. On the other hand, Twitter was a little different. So Metamaterials actually did receive 40% of the votes, but barely 1% above was Ideanomics, and Hyliion Holdings was about 18%, and then something else was about 1%. So there's a lot of you guys that believe in Ideanomics. However, if I had to select, and don't get me wrong, I love all three of these companies. I believe in all three of these companies. I think Hyliion might have a slight edge, and that's primarily because the administration right now that's in the government is really concerned about greenhouse emissions. They're having companies take this initiative to be zero emissions by 2030, 2025, 2050, et cetera, et cetera. And we all know that one of the bigger factors of greenhouse emissions is from transportation. And one of the biggest types of vehicles that transports the most is Class 8 vehicles, potentially going from one side of the country to the other. Hyliion definitely has an edge by having two different approaches, which will hopefully persuade fleet owners of diesel vehicles to partner up with Hyliion and help take this approach to relieve that percentage and that responsibility that transportation has on greenhouse emissions. But that's just my personal opinion. Make sure you guys leave comments below what you guys think. Let me know if I sound blasphemous at anything or if you agree with anything. or if there's any companies that you feel like are going to make more of an impact than those three. Now, speaking of which, I know I didn't show too much love with Ideanomics, but I really did like their acquisition with Biomotor, so make sure you check out this video, which I think you're going to enjoy. But I appreciate you guys watching, and until next time, take care.